In 1972, 45 people crashed into a frozen mountainside at 11,500 feet in the Andes. They weren't trained survivalists. They weren't mountaineers. They were teenage rugby players, their families, and two pilots flying to a match in Chile. The plane hit a ridge, sheared off both wings, and slid to a stop on a glacier with no trees, no shelter, and temperatures that dropped to -40 at night. 12 died on impact. 5 more died overnight. And for the 28 who remained, rescue never came. What happened next became one of the most studied survival cases in modern history, not because they lived, but because of what living required. This is not a story of heroes. This is a story of ordinary people forced to choose between starvation and something that still disturbs us to name. Nando Paradu. The name became famous decades later. But on October 13, 1972, he was just a 22-year-old engineering student heading to Santiago with his mother and sister. His real name was Fernando Sealer Paradu Dalgue. Unlike many survival stories, his identity wasn't erased by colonizers or lost to history. But something was taken from him on that mountain that no name could restore. What we know, he played rugby for the Old Christians Club in Montevideo. He was engaged to be married. He loved racing cars. What he knew with devastating clarity on that first morning. His mother was dead, crushed in the fuselage. His sister Susanna lay dying, her injuries beyond help. And the radio inside the broken cockpit was playing news reports. The search had been called off. They were alone. To understand what those 28 survivors faced, you have to understand where they crashed. The Andes mountain range runs 4,500 miles along South America's western spine. It contains some of the tallest peaks outside the Himalayas. The crash site sat in a remote valley between Argentina and Chile, at an elevation where the air holds 40% less oxygen than sea level. The glacier they landed on was steep, smooth, featureless white in every direction. No vegetation, no animals, no liquid water without melting snow. Nothing but rock and ice and sky. The average temperature during their October through December ordeal ranged from -25 Fahrenheit at night to barely above freezing during brief afternoon sun. Wind gusts topped 100 miles per hour during storms. Avalanches swept down from the peaks without warning. Archaeological evidence shows high mountain environments have supported human transit for thousands of years. The Incas built roads through these passes. Traders crossed them with llamas carrying goods. Spanish colonizers marched armies through gaps that seemed impassable. The difference was preparation. According to historian John Hemming's accounts of Andean crossings, indigenous people spent generations learning these routes. They knew where water ran in certain seasons. They knew which valleys trapped deadly weather. They knew to carry coca leaves for altitude sickness and dried meat for protein. The Old Christians rugby team had packed for a weekend in Santiago. They had dress shoes, sport coats, light sweaters. Some brought gifts for Chilean hosts they would never meet. The plane carried food for a 3-hour flight. Chocolate bars, wine, some crackers. When the fuselage stopped sliding, they had perhaps 2 weeks of rations if strictly divided. After that, the equation became simple. There was only one source of protein on that mountain, and it was already dead. On October 13, 1972, the Fairchild FH-227D left Montevideo carrying the Old Christians rugby team to a match in Chile. The pilot, Julio Cesar Ferradas, had over 5,000 hours of flight experience. His co-pilot, Dante Laguerara, had flown this route before. But weather over the Andes forced them to land overnight in Mendoza, Argentina. The next afternoon, they tried again. Standard procedure was to fly south through the Planchon Pass, a lower route that avoided the highest peaks. At 3:21 p.m., the co-pilot radioed air traffic control in Santiago. He reported passing Planchon and beginning descent. He was wrong. Cloud cover had obscured the mountains below. Navigation in 1972 relied on timing and radio beacons, not GPS. Laguerara calculated their position using dead reckoning. A headwind stronger than expected had slowed them. They were still deep in the mountains when they dropped below the clouds. The pilots saw black rock fill the windscreen. Ferradas pulled up hard. The plane clipped a ridge. The tail section tore away, taking 2 rows of seats and 5 passengers into the void. Then the wings hit. The fuselage became a toboggan. It slid 2,000 feet down a snowfield before stopping on a glacier. The impact killed some instantly. Others survived with injuries that would take days to kill them. Seats had torn loose from the floor. Bodies tangled with luggage and debris. Nando Paradu lay unconscious for 3 days with a fractured skull. When he woke, his mother was dead and his sister was fading. She died 8 days later in his arms. The survivors had salvaged what they could. Some suitcases, the pilot's seats for makeshift walls, a transistor radio that only received, couldn't transmit. That first night, the temperature dropped to -30. The immediate problem was shelter. The fuselage had no back end. Wind tore straight through. The survivors stuffed luggage into the gap, then bodies of the dead. It sounds gruesome now. At the time, it was insulation. Let me walk you through exactly how they made that broken tube survivable. First, they gathered every piece of fabric available. Seat covers, clothing from the dead, luggage contents. Then they created a layered barrier system. Suitcases formed the base wall across the open tail. Above that, packed snow. Above that, more fabric. The challenge was wind. Even small gaps allowed 60-mile-per-hour gusts to plunge interior temperatures below survival thresholds. The solution required constant maintenance. Every morning, someone crawled outside to pack fresh snow into cracks that had formed overnight. They rotated this duty because frostbite hit exposed hands within minutes. Modern survival engineers estimate this shelter design would take a trained team with proper tools about 2 hours to construct. These untrained survivors worked with frozen fingers and improvised materials. They refined their technique over weeks. They discovered seat covers could be ripped apart and layered for warmth. Wool socks stretched over hands became mittens. Rugby shirts wrapped around heads blocked the cold that would otherwise steal body heat faster than the wind. Water came easier than expected. They fashioned aluminum sheets from the plane's interior into shallow troughs. These were positioned at angles to catch the midday sun. Snow melted into trickles they caught in bottles and wine containers salvaged from the wreck. Hydration wasn't the killer. Starvation was. The rations ran out in 10 days. What followed remains difficult to discuss even now. Contemporary accounts from survivors, documented by author Piers Paul Read in 1974, described the decision in clinical terms. The dead were frozen solid. They had been friends, family members, teammates, but they were also protein. The first to suggest it was a medical student named Roberto Canessa. He understood the biology. The body cannibalizes itself during starvation. Muscle wastes, organs fail. The brain, which demands glucose, begins to shut down. Human flesh contains roughly the same nutritional value as any other mammal meat. There was no other option. Some refused at first. Others argued theology. The Catholic faith, many of them shared, prohibited desecration of the dead. But was this desecration? Or was it communion in its most literal sense, the dead giving their bodies so others might live? According to survivor accounts documented by Piers Paul Read, the group held something like a vote. Not formal, but a consensus emerged over several agonizing conversations. Most eventually participated. Sources conflict on exactly when this began. Most accounts place it around day 10. By then, several survivors had weakened past the point of recovery. Faces had grown hollow. Some could no longer stand. Let me explain how they managed the process. The bodies stayed frozen outside, preserved by temperatures that rarely climbed above freezing. Someone would volunteer to cut small strips using broken glass or the edge of a metal seat bracket they'd sharpened on rock. The pieces were thin, maybe an inch wide. These strips were laid on the white fuselage roof to dry in the sun. This accomplished 2 things. It made the meat easier to chew, and it created psychological distance. Something dried on metal looked less human than something cut from a recognizable form. They never cooked the meat. Fire required fuel they didn't have. The occasional scrap of paper or fabric burned too quickly to generate cooking heat. The flesh was consumed raw, partially dried. Survivors later described the act in clinical terms. They forced themselves to swallow without tasting. They thought of it as medicine, as protein, as anything but what it was. We can't know for sure what those first moments felt like, but evidence suggests the psychological barrier was highest initially. Once crossed, the survival instinct normalized what would have been unthinkable weeks before. Modern survival experts estimate the protein intake needed to maintain basic function at altitude would require approximately 4 to 6 ounces per person per day. With 27 bodies eventually available after the avalanche claimed more lives, the macabre mathematics extended their timeline by months. The psychological cost was separate. Isolation at altitude does specific things to the mind. Modern research on extreme isolation, including studies of polar expeditions and solitary confinement, documents a progression. First comes disorientation in time, then auditory disturbances, then paranoia, then breakdown. But the Andes survivors weren't alone. They had each other. And this distinction, according to psychologists who later studied the case, may explain their unusual mental stability. Dr. Gustavo Nicolich, a medical student among the survivors, organized group prayers each evening. Roberto Canessa led exercise routines to keep blood circulating. Nando Paradu, once recovered from his head injury, became obsessed with escape planning. These weren't random coping mechanisms. They were structure. Historians still debate whether this was conscious strategy or instinct. Either way, the pattern held. Survivors assigned roles. Some melted water. Some maintained the shelter. Some cut the meat. Routine became survival. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The transistor radio, which they'd salvaged from the cockpit, picked up news from Montevideo and Santiago. They heard their own names read during memorial services. They heard the search declared over after 8 days. No one was looking. By late October, the reality settled in. The only way off this mountain was to walk. On October 29th, 17 days after the crash, an avalanche hit. The survivors had moved inside the fuselage for the night. Snow came through the open tail section in a wave. It buried them. 8 people died that night. Suffocated. Crushed. Some who survived were trapped for hours, breathing through tiny air pockets, listening to friends die inches away. The morning revealed their shelter filled to the ceiling with packed snow. Digging out took 2 days. What's remarkable from a psychological perspective isn't that this broke them. It's that it didn't. The avalanche killed hope of rescue. It also killed passivity. Roy Harley rigged the plane's radio to batteries, hoping to transmit a distress signal. The effort failed, but it occupied minds. Gustavo Zerbino and Roberto Canessa began exploring the glacier's edges, mapping possible routes down. And Nando Paradu began planning an expedition west, toward Chile. The map in his head was simple. The sun set over Chile. Walk toward the sunset. Find help. The execution was impossible. No one recorded exactly when they decided to send an expedition, but most accounts place serious planning around early November. The challenge was this. They were on a glacier surrounded by peaks topping 15,000 feet. They had no mountaineering gear, no crampons, no ropes, no ice axes, just rugby shoes, frozen fingers, and starvation-weakened bodies. The first attempts failed. Survivors would hike a few hundred yards, encounter a cliff or crevasse, and turn back. Altitude sickness dropped men who'd seemed healthy. One short expedition left 3 survivors snowblind for days. But each attempt gathered intelligence. They discovered the terrain to the east sloped downward, suggesting lower valleys. However, Argentina lay that direction, meaning longer distance to civilization. West meant climbing first, crossing a ridge, then descending into Chile. Paradu chose west. The preparations took weeks of careful planning. Every decision was life or death. For footwear, they wrapped rugby shoes in seat cushion foam, then bound them with electrical wire stripped from the plane's wiring. This created crude insulation against snow that would otherwise conduct body heat away from feet in hours. For clothing, they layered everything available. 3 pairs of pants, multiple shirts, sweaters stripped from the dead. The outer layer came from the pilot's leather jacket, which offered wind resistance the cotton couldn't match. For food, they packed human meat into rugby socks. Each sock held roughly a day's protein. They carried 8 days' worth between 3 men. The calculation was brutal but precise. If they hadn't found help by then, they wouldn't find it at all. For navigation, they had nothing. No compass, no map, just the position of the sun and Pareto's conviction that walking toward sunset meant walking toward Chile. Let me describe the sleeping system they designed. At altitude, ground contact kills. The Earth conducts heat away from a body faster than air. The solution was insulation layers beneath, not just above. They cut seat cushions into rectangles, creating makeshift sleeping pads. These were stuffed inside the remaining fabric they could carry. At night, all 3 men would huddle together, sharing body heat, positioned with the pads beneath and every spare fabric layer on top. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept them alive through nights at 14,000 feet with no tent. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, Nando Paradu, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin began climbing. No one recorded exactly when they decided to send an expedition, but most accounts place serious planning around early November. The challenge was this: they were on a glacier surrounded by peaks topping 15,000 feet. They had no mountaineering gear, no crampons, no ropes, no ice axes, just rugby shoes, frozen fingers, and starvation-weakened bodies. The first attempts failed. Survivors would hike a few hundred yards, encounter a cliff or crevasse, and turn back. Altitude sickness dropped men who'd seemed healthy. One short expedition left 3 survivors snowblind for days. But each attempt gathered intelligence. They discovered the terrain to the east sloped downward, suggesting lower valleys. However, Argentina lay that direction, meaning longer distance to civilization. West meant climbing first, crossing a ridge, then descending into Chile. Paradu chose west. The preparations took weeks of careful planning. Every decision was life or death. For footwear, they wrapped rugby shoes in seat cushion foam, then bound them with electrical wire stripped from the plane's wiring. This created crude insulation against snow that would otherwise conduct body heat away from feet in hours. For clothing, they layered everything available. 3 pairs of pants, multiple shirts, sweaters stripped from the dead. The outer layer came from the pilot's leather jacket, which offered wind resistance the cotton couldn't match. For food, they packed human meat into rugby socks. Each sock held roughly a day's protein. They carried 8 days' worth between 3 men. The calculation was brutal but precise. If they hadn't found help by then, they wouldn't find it at all. For navigation, they had nothing. No compass, no map, just the position of the sun and Pareto's conviction that walking toward sunset meant walking toward Chile. Let me describe the sleeping system they designed. At altitude, ground contact kills. The Earth conducts heat away from a body faster than air. The solution was insulation layers beneath, not just above. They cut seat cushions into rectangles, creating makeshift sleeping pads. These were stuffed inside the remaining fabric they could carry. At night, all 3 men would huddle together, sharing body heat, positioned with the pads beneath and every spare fabric layer on top. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept them alive through nights at 14,000 feet with no tent. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, Nando Paradu, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin began climbing. No one recorded exactly when they decided to send an expedition, but most accounts place serious planning around early November. The challenge was this: they were on a glacier surrounded by peaks topping 15,000 feet. They had no mountaineering gear, no crampons, no ropes, no ice axes, just rugby shoes, frozen fingers, and starvation-weakened bodies. The first attempts failed. Survivors would hike a few hundred yards, encounter a cliff or crevasse, and turn back. Altitude sickness dropped men who'd seemed healthy. One short expedition left 3 survivors snowblind for days. But each attempt gathered intelligence. They discovered the terrain to the east sloped downward, suggesting lower valleys. However, Argentina lay that direction, meaning longer distance to civilization. West meant climbing first, crossing a ridge, then descending into Chile. Paradu chose west. The preparations took weeks of careful planning. Every decision was life or death. For footwear, they wrapped rugby shoes in seat cushion foam, then bound them with electrical wire stripped from the plane's wiring. This created crude insulation against snow that would otherwise conduct body heat away from feet in hours. For clothing, they layered everything available. 3 pairs of pants, multiple shirts, sweaters stripped from the dead. The outer layer came from the pilot's leather jacket, which offered wind resistance the cotton couldn't match. For food, they packed human meat into rugby socks. Each sock held roughly a day's protein. They carried 8 days' worth between 3 men. The calculation was brutal but precise. If they hadn't found help by then, they wouldn't find it at all. For navigation, they had nothing. No compass, no map. Just the position of the sun and Pareto's conviction that walking toward sunset meant walking toward Chile. Let me describe the sleeping system they designed. At altitude, ground contact kills. The Earth conducts heat away from a body faster than air. The solution was insulation layers beneath, not just above. They cut seat cushions into rectangles, creating makeshift sleeping pads. These were stuffed inside the remaining fabric they could carry. At night, all 3 men would huddle together, sharing body heat, positioned with the pads beneath and every spare fabric layer on top. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept them alive through nights at 14,000 feet with no tent. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, Nando Paradu, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin began climbing. What they accomplished over the next 7 days defied every survival manual written. They climbed to nearly 15,000 feet with no acclimatization. They crossed glaciers at night when the snow was hard enough to support weight. They descended valleys so steep they could only move by controlled sliding, digging feet into snow to break. According to Pareto's later account, documented in his 2006 memoir Miracle in the Andes, they walked approximately 38 miles over 10 days. Most of it was above treeline. Modern mountaineers who've retraced their route estimate the technical difficulty equivalent to a Class 3 alpine climb. Paradu and Canessa had never climbed anything. On day 9, they saw a river. On day 10, they found a rusted horseshoe and some cow dung. On the evening of December 20th, they spotted a man on horseback across a swollen river. They screamed and waved, but the water was too loud. The man rode away. That night, they slept without knowing if they'd been seen. Morning came. The man returned. His name was Sergio Catalan. He was a Chilean arriero, a herder who moved cattle through mountain pastures. He couldn't cross the river. Neither could they. Catalan wrapped a note around a rock and threw it. Paradu wrote back, "I come from a plain that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a friend up there who is injured. In the plain there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come to get us? Please, we can't even walk. Where are we?" Catalan threw back bread, cheese, and a promise. He would ride to the nearest town and send help. Help came the next day. Helicopters arrived on December 22nd. 14 survivors still waited at the fuselage, over 70 days after the crash. On December 22, 1972, Chilean Air Force helicopters reached the crash site. The pilots reported being unprepared for what they saw. Emaciated figures stood waving from a field of debris and human remains. Bones and frozen tissue lay scattered across the snow. The scene was documented by military photographers but not immediately released to media. The survivors had lost an average of 50 pounds each. Their faces were burned black from reflected ultraviolet radiation at altitude. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes on several. Due to weather conditions, only 6 survivors could be evacuated on the first flight. The remaining 8 spent one more night on the mountain. One final night after 71 already. All 16 survivors were evacuated by December 23rd. Many required immediate hospitalization. Doctors in Santiago treated frostbite, severe malnutrition, dehydration, altitude-induced edema, and psychological trauma that would take decades to fully process. The irony that followed haunts this story. These 16 had survived 72 days in conditions that kill experienced mountaineers in hours. They had walked across terrain that professional climbers prepare months to attempt. They had done something so psychologically impossible that theologians and ethicists still argue about it. And the world's first response was judgment. When media discovered the cannibalism, the story became sensation. Headlines screamed. Some called them heroes. Others called them criminals. The Catholic Church was asked to rule on whether they'd sinned. Depending on which account you trust, the survivors handled this differently. Some never spoke publicly. Others, like Pardieu and Canessa, became advocates for survival education. Roberto Canessa became a pediatric cardiologist. He pioneered heart surgery techniques in Uruguay and was once nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Nando Pardieu became a television producer and motivational speaker. He returned to the crash site in 2006 for the first time since the rescue. Of the original 45 passengers and crew, 29 died. Some on impact, some from injuries, some from the avalanche, some from starvation in the final days. The bodies were never fully recovered from the glacier. In 2016, clothing and bone fragments were still melting out of the ice. This story endures because it resists easy interpretation. The Andes case remains the longest duration survival in high-altitude conditions without external support ever documented. Historians still debate whether their success came from group cohesion, individual leadership, or pure statistical luck. Of the roughly 200 documented isolation survival cases exceeding 1 year, almost none involve high altitude. Cold kills faster than starvation. Altitude kills faster than cold. The mathematics of their survival shouldn't compute. What separates those who lived from those who didn't, according to survival psychologist John Leach, comes down to 3 factors: acceptance of reality, maintenance of hope, and group cooperation. The Andes survivors scored high on all 3. They accepted that rescue wouldn't come. They maintained hope through planning and action. They cooperated even when cooperation required acts no one would choose freely. But the uncomfortable questions remain. Was this heroism or instinct? Faith or desperation? Should we celebrate their survival or mourn what survival demanded? These aren't questions with answers. They're questions that reveal something about the asker. Nando Pardieu, in interviews decades later, never used the word hero. He preferred survivor. The distinction matters. "I did not survive because I was special," he said. "I survived because I refused to die." Those 16 walked off that mountain not because fate chose them, not because destiny had plans. They walked because they kept walking when every signal from body, mind, and circumstance screamed to stop. And that choice, made moment by moment for 72 days without witnesses or guarantees, remains something harder than courage. It was refusal. If stories like this make you see survival differently, consider supporting the channel. Like the video, subscribe, and join us for more true accounts of ordinary people facing the impossible and deciding, against every reason, to live.